Good evening. This is the October 25th, 2010 meetup of the Austin Constitution Meetup. I'm Jon Roland, and tonight we're going to be discussing several things. I've been asked to talk about a little bit about health care, so I'm going to do that by referring to the current state of the healthcare litigation that has been launched. Attorney General McCollum of Florida filed the initial petition in federal court there, and 19 other state attorney generals signed on to it, which might sound like a fairly powerful array of people backing it. However, there are some problems. The litigation was drafted by an acquaintance of mine, David Rifkin, basically a libertarian lawyer, and he had drafted it based upon the state of the litigation, of the legislation, before it was adopted, while it was still being debated in Congress. So he tried to get ahead of the game, expecting to file a lawsuit on it immediately after it was adopted. And unfortunately, the way it was written up was not for the bill that actually got adopted. So we have a problem in that sense. Congress has the last couple of days before the bill passed, changed a couple of things. And what they changed is significant, because what they did is they introduced two provisions, one of which forbade the IRS, which is the collection agent for the mandatory health insurance, to levy, and the second of all, it forbade them to lien on taxpayers in order to collect the insurance premiums. Now, usually when people contemplate the IRS collecting money from people, they think in terms of them either levying or liening. Now, to explain the difference, for those who will be viewing the video and may not be familiar with the difference, the levy process basically is taking the money out of your bank account. And the liening process is putting a lien on your property, especially real property, and then foreclosing on it. However, if they can't use either method to collect, and of course the question immediately arises, well, how can they collect on the insurance premiums? And the answer is that they can't collect directly. They can't send an agent out to collect the premium from you. all they can do is to, if they have money of yours that they've already collected, is to not give it back to you. So for example, if they have your employer collecting money as withholding, and he has sent the money into the IRS, and you filed your taxes without paying the insurance premium as part of your 1040 return, what the IRS would do is send you a notice of deficiency saying you still owe this amount of money, which would probably be about $800 if you paid everything else that in the normal course you think you would owe. Looking generally around $700 to $800, maybe a little more, for the insurance premium. So, if you said that, well, the insurance premium is unconstitutional, I don't want it, I'm not going to pay for it, and they says, well, you've already paid for it, we got the money, now we're going after your regular taxes. And in law, what a person can do in that situation, you can sue to get the money back, but you have to pay everything they claim you owe. So you would have to pay the additional $800 that they're billing you for, but if they decided to tack on interest and penalties and a bunch of other stuff, they could run up a $6,000 tax bill, say, to $60,000. You know, that's a matter of a few strokes of a pen. So suddenly you're having to pay not $6,000, but $60,000 plus attorney's fees to sue to get $800 back. So that's the way the game is played. Now, what a lot of state legislatures, state doors, what we're thinking about doing, Leo Berman, for example, drafted a bill for the state house which would make it a crime for an IRS agent to come into the state to collect an insurance premium. Well, obviously that's not going to work. First of all, it would be struck down instantly by a federal court. If somebody tried to enforce it, they'd be arrested for interfering with a federal officer. And secondly, and finally, the IRS agent, even if he wanted to collect the insurance premium, wouldn't have to send an agent into the state at all. He could do it from out of state, where Texas would not have jurisdiction. Do it from Martinsburg, West Virginia, for example. So if we can look at here we go. Here's a summary of the key points. There were 6 what are called claims for relief in the litigation, in the original petition. The first one was the individual mandate and concomitant penalty exceed congressional authority under the Commerce Clause and violate the 9th and 10th Amendments. Now, first of all, I commend Rifkin for bringing in the 9th Amendment. The 9th Amendment has very seldom been argued in federal court on any case, and it'll be useful to bring it in. Okay, that one was not dismissed.
Can you slide that to the right of the screen?
Which?
Can't see the right part of the text there. You can slide the scroll bar over.
Well, it looks different on mine.
Oh, it does.
Yeah, let's see if this.
There we go.
Okay, there we go. Now, so that one survived, at least at this stage. The second one, which was dismissed, the individual mandate and penalty violate substantive due process under the 5th Amendment. That was dismissed. The judge gave his explanation why. I won't go into it right now. The opinion is right here. You can click on it and read the whole thing. Number 3 was dismissed as moot. It was arguing if the penalty imposed for failing to comply with the individual mandate is found to be a tax, it is an unconstitutional, unapportioned capitation or direct tax in violation of the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4, and the 9th and 10th Amendments. It was dismissed as moot because basically the penalty has not been assessed to anyone yet. So the way the courts handle claims is that for claims for actual actions by government officials, the actions have to have already occurred or be imminent. And these are not imminent until about 2012 to 2015. So they're not anywhere close. Number 4, this one was not dismissed. The Act coerces and commandeers the states with respect to Medicaid by altering and expanding the program in violation of Article 1 and the 9th and 10th Amendments. Now, this is the one claim that allows the attorney generals to stay in. So that's the only thing that they've got going for them in this case. And it's not clear that they're going to be able to effectively argue that the states are commandeered when Medicaid itself is optional. State doesn't have to accept it. And a court is very likely to conclude that, well, you can avoid the coercion and commandeering by just not accepting Medicaid. Just opt out of the Medicaid program. Number 5, which was dismissed, it coerces and commandeers with respect to the health benefit exchanges in violation of Article 1 and the 9th and 10th Amendment. And he explains why he dismissed that. And then number 6 was dismissed. The employer mandates interfere with the state's sovereignty as large employers and in the performance of government functions in violation and so forth. Again, this was dismissed because essentially the judge is saying, let's decide this case on claims number 1 and number 4 only. Now, what is the problem with number 1? I indicated why I thought number 4 was not going to survive. With number 1, we run into the problem of whether or not the penalty is a penalty. In other words, a kind of criminal sanction, or whether it's a tax. it says it's a penalty in the Act, but just because it says it's a penalty doesn't necessarily make it one.
So are you saying that they modified the legislation just at the 11th hour so that they could avoid being unconstitutional?
Well, to avoid
the levy.
Yeah, to avoid these avenues of attack on the constitutionality.
So maybe they had access to this text, or they anticipated this text, and that's why they made those changes at the 11th hour, even though they kind of jumped through hoops by doing this.
Well, it didn't require them to spy on David in his study. The strategy was being openly discussed on the internet and in forums, for months leading up to this. So,
so that's why they did the convoluted approach, to try to get the money in a weird way, just so they can avoid this. Right. The obvious, even though they're knows they're doing it to us.
The court could decide that it's not a penalty, that it's really just a tax on not buying something.
So the question becomes, if the courts interpret what Congress is doing in spirit, even though they might have gotten away through it with a loophole, if the courts will enforce it in the spirit of the law, in the spirit of the Constitution, the courts would still strike them down what they're doing, right?
Well, they might.
If it's an honest court.
If it's an honest court. Now, Judge Vinson, in this case, did a pretty good job of writing the opinion. Obviously, he put a lot of work into it. It is not a half-assed piece of legal scholarship. But what it does point to the way in which the whole case is likely to be dismissed. Because if the IRS simply withholds the penalty, and this may have to wait for an actual case for it to happen, and there's some individual plaintiffs in this as well as state attorney general. It's not just a state attorney general. See, there's an old case from 1923, Massachusetts v. Mellon. It's a companion case to Frothingham v. Mellon. The two cases got merged in the final opinion. The issue at Frothingham was whether or not a person had standing to sue if he had not been personally injured. And the court ruled that he did not. That was the beginning of both the standing doctrine and the cases and controversies doctrine, under which the court refuses to hear cases unless somebody's either actually injured or is facing injury. In Massachusetts v. Mellon, the private citizen was being represented in court by his state, in that case Massachusetts. The doctrine under which this was done, and it's an ancient doctrine going back hundreds of years, is that a state can go to court representing the rights of an individual. The doctrine is called in parens patriae. And the court struck that down as well. It said the state cannot represent an individual. He has to come into court on his own, with his own lawyers representing himself. Now, that wouldn't necessarily forbid the state paying for his lawyers, but for essentially what it means was the individual, the private party, has to appear as the party directly and not under cover of his state. So, what this is likely to be, if we knock out 4 here, then all that's going to leave is 1, and that'll probably mean essentially knocking out all the state attorney generals. And then they'll knock out for the individuals because they haven't actually been penalized yet. But even if they are, if the IRS collects the money from the employer through withholding, then as I explained earlier, they now have the money. The guy files his 1040. It does not include the penalty, saying that he doesn't owe it. And the IRS just gives him a notice of deficiency. It's okay, you still owe $800, not for the penalty, you've paid that. You now owe it for taxes, regular taxes. And in order to get the $800 back, he would have to pay the deficiency on his tax bill, and by that time they're liable to load on a bunch of interest and penalties and so forth, which they can easily do, very quickly to large numbers. So a guy could start with a $6,000 tax bill, leave out $800. They would collect the $6,000, charge him for the additional $800 as unpaid taxes, and then run up the bill to $60,000 and make him pay that before he could sue to get the old amount back with the $800. And of course, we don't know if these are people who could afford to pay the whole thing before they sued to get it back. So this is the way the game is stacked against taxpayers. By the way, I should mention that an excellent book on the income tax, Judicial Tyranny on Your Income Tax, by Jeffrey Dickstein. I put it up previously on my website, but now I've also made it a Kindle book. So if you have a Kindle, or if you have a Kindle app on your smartphone, you can read the book. It's an excellent book. It's not too inaccessible for a layman, although it does, of course, it is intended largely for lawyers and accountants and people like that, professionals. But you can see how the court cases proceeded from case to case, and never ever at any point established wages or compensation for labor to be income subject to taxation. They carefully avoided doing that. So his argument, and it's a pretty good one given the documentation of the cases he provides, is that compensation for labor is not income. Now he doesn't get into it, but similar arguments could be used for estate and inheritance taxes and things of that sort. So it only takes cases up to 1990. Jeff has been under some duress. I haven't heard the results, but he was supposed to appear in Florida today on a contempt of court action. The judge is trying to put him in jail for 6 months for making the argument that the income tax on compensation for labor is unconstitutional, just for raising the issue. So that's where we are right now. I'll probably find out later tonight whether Jeff's in jail for 6 months or what, but in the meantime I put his book online, and we're hopefully generate some income from it to pay some of his costs. So Jeff's an example of a patriot lawyer, one of the few who was willing to virtually give his life to defend the Constitution and the rights of the American people, and he deserves our support.
Does he have a wife and children?
I I don't think so. I think they're all grown in a way.
Okay. Does he have the funds available to?
No, he's having to borrow money just to get to Florida.
So he's in a tough situation,
Yeah.
fighting this battle. Jeffrey Dickstein?
Yeah. I have an email on the subject
Okay.
on the
I saw it.
website.
Does he have friends or family though that can help him?
Well, he has friends, but most of them are not able to help him. Here is the notice on the book. Okay. Now, what I've been saying, and I didn't have time to prepare for this evening, how I would have written that lawsuit. I know pretty well how I would write it. It would not prevail, but as Attorney General, they probably wouldn't throw me in jail for contempt of court if I made the argument. Hopefully. If they tried to, we might have a little standoff with the Texas Rangers, or who knows what might happen. But what I have advised lawyers close to the case is that they need to have a plan B, as it were, that challenges the whole issue of income tax and withholding. Now, I don't think we're going to be able to go after income tax on compensation for labor being unconstitutional. But we may be able to challenge withholding being used in that way.
I don't follow the difference.
Well, in effect, you're using employers to collect insurance premiums. And the idea would be to attack not all withholding, but just withholding of insurance premiums. And if an insurance premium formed any part of the money that IRS would keep out of the amount withheld, they would have to refund it. In other words, they can collect it, they might try to collect it directly, but they can't do it through the employer. It would be a little bit like saying, well, let's say that somebody owed the government money, let's say for a parking ticket in a national park. And he had a job, okay? Would it be constitutional for them to take the fine for the parking ticket out of what was withheld by his employer, apply it to paying this fine, and then go after him for the unpaid taxes? Now, the way this argument would work is a little bit subtle, and it would be difficult to go into all the subtleties in a meeting like this, but it gives you an idea of the way in which a person has to strategize litigation in order to have a chance to get a favorable outcome. Sometimes you have to be very creative. It's a kind of cat and mouse game where you're trying to anticipate everything that the opposition could do. They're trying to anticipate what you would do, and you would try to anticipate what they would do if they anticipate what you would do, and you keep trying to find ways past whatever barriers that they might erect in their move. Now, of course, eventually you run out of moves, but at this stage at least, there are still a few moves left. Now, the litigation would primarily be for political theater. The courts are not going to rule against the government on income taxes or on anything else that the IRS tries to collect from people. And if the IRS wants to collect for child support or student loans or anything else they might want to collect on, it would face the same problem. So the question is, can they commandeer a private employer, or for that matter, a state employer, because that's one of the issues here, and make him hold money out for these other obligations? So let's say, for example, that this employer withholds just enough to cover the regular tax on his compensation for labor, and the IRS says, no, you didn't withhold enough. You didn't withhold enough to cover the insurance, or child support, or that parking ticket fine, or student loans, or whatever, yada, yada, yada. So we're going to fine you and penalize you, maybe throw you in jail for not having held that money. So the angle that has to be taken then is to examine that alternative. But again, you're not going to be able to explore that until somebody's been injured. You actually have to have an employer who has refused to withhold and been penalized for it, and then he has to go to court. There are not very many employers who are going to want to do that. Especially either they're too small to fight the government or so big that the government is one of their customers and they're afraid of losing business. When I worked for Home Depot, I got a pretty strong indication that somebody, probably representing the government, suggested that I be terminated, or Home Depot might lose its big contracts with the government. Now, I don't know if I got anywhere, because I left Home Depot on a disability before anything could have come of that. But it does illustrate the way these things can work. So, we've discussed a little bit the problem of litigating this medical bill. Now let's discuss a little bit my approach of nullification. Now, what members of the state legislature and several nullification proponents, mainly at the 10th Amendment Center, have been advocating is just legislators passing bills opposing this, that, or the other provision of the health care bill or any other federal legislation that they want to try to nullify. Well, if all the bill does is simply express disapproval or objection, that accomplishes nothing. If you try to arrest a federal agent, that's not going to work. For example, what happens if, let's say, a federal agent commits a crime within a state? He, let's say he pulls his gun and accidentally shoots an innocent bystander. And maybe it wasn't so unintentional. Maybe it was the guy was his rival for this girl or somebody and decided to eliminate his rival. Anyway, he's suspected of murder. So the local DA has him arrested, tries to prosecute him. Now what's going to happen in that case? Well, before the agent even hits the jail, a Department of Justice lawyer is going to file a notice of removal in state court. That's a very simple pleading. It just says removal and to the federal court. And I've done it myself. I've removed a case from state court to federal court. You just file it. It's automatic. At that point, the state court is stuck. It cannot do it anymore with that case. So then you have to wait for federal court to decide what it wants to do with it. Well, the federal court can either hear it or they can remand it back to the state court, or they could dismiss it in state court. In other words, they could say it's an invalid case, it's dead. But it was killed in federal court, not in state court. What federal courts regularly do with federal agents is they dismiss the case on grounds that the agent was on duty and therefore enjoys official immunity. Now, at that point, if he did commit murder, who's going to prosecute him? Well, the U.S. Attorney could, under 18 U.S.C. 241 and 242, but he probably won't. It's more likely he got a reprimand and says, you got to be more careful, get some training in the use of your weapon. Don't go around shooting people that, might be rivals for your girlfriend, And maybe give you a 1 week suspension with pay. That's the way the federal government works. That's what they did with Lon Horiuchi, who killed Vicki Weaver and her child in the Ruby Ridge incident. The guy was a sniper. He pulled the trigger, killed Vicki. The local DA tried to prosecute him, removed to federal court, and immediately dismissed. So, this kind of thing happens all the time.
So you're saying that's what's going to happen to a nullification approach if it was taken?
Well, to attempt to arrest a federal agent.
Okay. But
That approach will not work. And if somebody tried to do it, they could be arrested for obstruction of justice. 5 to 10 years in the federal penitentiary. So, needless to say, that's an avenue of redress that isn't really going to be available. The only thing that can really be done is for people in a state to refuse to cooperate with federal agents when they try to do something unconstitutional. They can, for example, refuse to talk to them. Don't answer any of their questions. They can, if they sit on a jury, refuse to convict. If they are state officials or contractors, they can refuse to cooperate with the feds, saying we're not going to give you any information, we're not going to talk to you, we're not going to work with you, we're not going to go on raids with you. We're not going to have any fusion centers with you. Okay? If you want to pursue this, you're going to do it entirely on your own. And oh, by the way, our public-owned utility is no longer going to be providing you with electricity, water, sewer, or gas. If you want to have an office here in Texas, I guess you're going to have to truck all those things in. And we're not going to keep any of your prisoners in our jails. We're just not going to work with you. And if they did enough of that sort of thing, very diligently, eventually, the feds would probably have to back down. They cannot really afford to do most of what they do without the cooperation of local people. At some point, it becomes untenable. Unless it's a really, really important issue. The chances are that nullification of the federal income tax and collection of it would probably be too big a one to tackle. I mean, the feds might very well send in the Army and the Marines and, tanks and bombers and something like that if the income tax were an issue. But for most other lesser issues, probably not. So you got to pick your battles. Now, what I have proposed, and I'm having trouble getting support for, frankly, is what I call a Federal Action Review Commission. Now, the problem with that name is that the acronym is FARC, which is the name of a guerrilla group in Colombia. It would otherwise make a good acronym. Call it Nullification Commission for short. The idea is to create a grand jury, 23 members, but selected not just at random from the population, but after a screening process that would select for people with some legal education, but not lawyers, not judges, not government employees, and not people on pensions. So, what the Nullification Commission would be empowered to do would be to hear citizen complaints about federal actions being unconstitutional. And they wouldn't necessarily have to be injuries that they had suffered. It could be prospective injuries. It could just be general violations of the Constitution that hadn't affected anybody yet. See, grand jury can hold hearings on anything. Anybody can testify to Word 1 on any issue whatsoever. There are none of the restraints that courts seem to feel they have. So, and of course, a grand jury does not have to reach a decision on the basis of a single complaint. They can hear a complaint and a few months later hear another complaint on the same subject, each time gathering some more evidence, and then another, and another, and another, and gradually build up a case file on this issue. And at some point, they might feel it's appropriate to come up with a finding. A report for grand jury is called a presentment, in which they might say something like, we have reviewed the evidence and find that such and such an activity on the part of the federal government is without constitutional authority. Now, under the commission proposal, that would trigger non-cooperation by the entire state. State officials, agents, and contractors would at that point all be forbidden to cooperate with the federal government on the exercise of that power. They would be shielded from any kind of reprimand or reassignment or firing or anything else for violating a federal statute in that situation, if that's what it involved. Private citizens would also be encouraged not to cooperate. And part of the proposal is also to create a fund. State Senator King called it a kind of civil defense fund, which would pay the lawyers for any private citizen who tried to stand up to the feds on that issue. So even if he lost and went to jail or whatever, at least his lawyers would be paid, his kids would be taken care of, his mortgage would be paid, his basic expenses would be met, he'd be supported. The state couldn't go in representing him, but it could do everything short of that. It could pay all of his bills. So, with this kind of comprehensive system in place, we could begin going after all kinds of unconstitutional federal actions. Now, I would recommend starting small. I'm not sure that healthcare itself is even the first one you'd want to start with. But obviously, if a lot of people are demanded, then we could hardly avoid it. But what you want to do is to pick at a few, get the feds to back down on those, then nibble, keep nibbling away at them. You take a bite out here, bite out there, you keep biting back, keep biting until they're pushed back and back and back and back. Anyway, that's my approach to the matter. Basically, it's civil disobedience, but organized at the state level.
Who convenes grand juries?
Well, once appointed, they convene themselves.
Who appoints grand juries?
Normally, a court appoints a grand jury, but not necessarily. It could be convened by a sheriff or other official. What my proposal contemplates is grand juries being selected by previous grand juries. So you'd have an initial grand jury whose only job would be to convene the real grand jury. And then each one thereafter would supervise the convening of the next one. So the process that I envision would start out by having a grand jury of each county, because normally they're organized by county. Some counties have more than one. The district court each has one. But for each grand jury in the state, nominates one person to be in a pool for the nullification commission. And so now we've got at least 254 or more, maybe 300, maybe 400 nominees into this pool.
Within Texas.
Within Texas. And what they would do in turn is conduct a sortition process to narrow their numbers down to some smaller number, let's say 200, 230, some such number. And they might, the surviving ones might decide among themselves, who is the best qualified to sit on this commission. Who knows the law best, but has no connections, that could be used to, unduly influence him. And finally, you whittle it down to about 230 and select the last 23 at random. And those are the grand jury, which initially a third of them would serve for 4 months, a third for 6 months, and a third for 8 months, and then thereafter they would go on a rotating cycle with a third being selected every 6 months. So there would be a certain amount of turnover all the time. And they would have a staff. They'd be able to hire assistants to assist them in the workload. And other than that, they'd be completely independent. They could issue their own subpoenas, enforceable by any court, and keep their own records, their own meeting times and places. They can meet electronically if they wish to, but whatever was convenient with them. But the important thing was that everybody would know how to contact them and how to bring a complaint to them. Needless to say, if we could get something like this instituted in at least 10 or 12 states, we would begin to have a serious rollback of federal usurpations. After a while, if a few states saw it being, working out well for them, you could have it catching on, people in every state demanding, we want a nullification commission too. So it could build on itself, to build momentum. That's the key to any such reform. We're never going to be able to win elections on constitutional subjects. People are just not going to educate themselves to the extent they would have to do that. People relate to personalities, not to complex issues. So,
that's a good point.
So we have to find ways to leverage reform that doesn't depend on either the public being broadly educated or on a special interest group driving the process. And the way you do that is you create an institution with a dynamic of its own. Now, of course, they would undoubtedly face opposition. There'd probably be a pretty strong movement to kill it. That's one reason that I proposed making it a constitutional amendment. So, not a U.S. Constitution, but a state constitutional amendment. So you try to entrench it that way to keep it from being killed. Because it would face intense opposition. We're talking about creating a force for reform that could revolutionize this country.
That's really good. I really like that idea because it's basically taking the grassroots movement and putting it inside the actual judicial channel, which is where justice is supposed to be realized. It's actually leveraging the channel appropriately, but it's just leveraging the power of the grassroots movement in that channel. And starting it at the state entity level is a brilliant idea.
Right.
We might have to work out some kinks, but I really do think that is an area that hasn't really been leveraged. I really do think that's a good idea.
How do you fund it, though? That's the hard part.
Well, the key factor is you'd have 23 people who, if in a pinch, could fund themselves. But I do contemplate they'd have a budget. But if they cut off their budget, they can still function. All they got to do is hold meetings and issue reports. They can issue subpoenas with, write it out on a piece of paper and hand it to the
And with
witness.
modern technology, you can actually do it remotely, which makes it even tougher to fight it, you know? So
That's
it's a
right.
distributed environment, so you can leverage it that way.
Unless the fuzz censors everything.
Until they take the internet down.
Yeah.
Well, that would be pretty hard to do.
There's
The,
a lot
the
of-
internet is designed to resist a,
There's a
a
lot of-
thermonuclear war.
Yeah. I mean,
Even if the
internet-
government tried to take it down,
It'd be
they
awesome.
couldn't do it.
Yeah, I don't think the government's actually that competent.
No, it's not a matter of confidence. The internet will always reroute around any interruption.
Well, I mean, they could infiltrate for a long time and identify a whole bunch of IPs and make it tough. But still, the source and destination are going to know who they are, and they can always tunnel other ways. So you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, the internet basically is a peer-to-peer network, so you can always get to it one way or the other. So
Yeah, and I'm
you
working
can't shut
with
it down.
several groups now. We're developing mesh networking. Now, mesh networking is a technology in which you have a number of independent nodes. These could be wireless nodes. That's what's contemplated. And whenever two of them are within range of one another, they establish a local area network automatically. And if the third joins in, he gets connected to one of them, and they are able to relay packets through the nodes on the network to get between any two of the nodes on the network. And in principle, you could have a mesh that spanned the entire continent. So you could have a wireless replacement for the trunked backbone internet. Now, it would be bandwidth limited. I don't think you'd want to try to send video over it. But for email or texting or things of that sort, it would work. But we're taking several different approaches. We have one that's local group here that's we're using the ham band, and others that are using 801, 802, 11 bands. So they're Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
So there are different approaches to it. But eventually, you could take a computer like this one, set up with it, and it would be communicating with another computer without the trunk internet being in between them. You're just passing packet to packet to packet for as far as until they are no longer connected.
Getting back to your original proposal, have you documented that or developed it to put it online anywhere? Do you have?
Which one?
Well, regarding convening grand juries or commissions.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I've been sending messages to this forum, since I developed it back in, I think, February. I guess you're not reading the messages.
I guess not. Well,
I probably have a few here right here.
have you shared that with any of the state legislatures? I mean, the
Yeah.
concept of having a constitution,
Yeah.
a Texas Constitution amendment.
Yeah.
Any feedback from?
Well,
I think that's a nice linchpin.
Berman is the only one Berman and Chisholm are the only two that have, no, King did too. The problem is getting them to sit still long enough to explain it to them.
Yeah.
All right, these are not, let's face it, our best and brightest.
Yeah, well, so maybe
It could take a lot of explaining.
Well, they listen if you get voters behind it. So if you get
Yeah.
a crowd behind it, then all of a sudden they start paying attention.
Yeah.
That's how they operate. So it's a little catch-22.
Well, what I'm trying to do now is to form a crowd
Yeah.
of constituents. So we can start with your own members of the legislature, or any of them that you know, any people you know who are constituents of likely. The main ones that are likely is the Conservative Coalition. I've been mainly working on those guys.
That's a formal group?
It's a formal group.
You
They have their
talk
own website.
Talking about the nationwide?
No, of the state of Texas.
State of Texas, okay.
Senator King is one of them. Leo Burma is another. you know, it's easy enough to find them. I don't, let's see, I'll just find them right now. Let's see here. I have a page of local search engines here. I think they call it a caucus. It is coalition, okay. Yeah, here are Phil King, Linda Harper Brown, Dan Flynn.
Are they senators or are they reps?
Those are reps.
It's just, yeah. Here are the board of directors. Wayne Christian, Linda Harper Brown, Ken Paxton, Leo Berman, Warren Chisholm, Brandon Creighton, Dan Flynn, Brian Hughes, Phil King, Jody Laubenberg, Jeannie Morrison, Tan Parker, and Larry Taylor. So those are the kind of people I've mainly been approaching. They seem to be the most receptive. I've discussed it with Democrats too, but obviously they're not going to, be receptive.
Well, I think it's a pretty good idea.
And of course, I don't have to discuss it with libertarians. They're all, they're immediately on board with pretty much anything I propose, but
Well, the problem with the Republicans is they're going to say they're receptive and they're going to do nothing, maybe.
yeah.
So, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, I, as the Attorney General candidate and Kathy Glass as the governor candidate are already pushing this idea, but of course she does it in fairly general terms. She doesn't try to go into details. She doesn't have time. When I get the chance, I try to go into details.
Well, I gotta leave in just a couple minutes because it's on the stage, but on your next meeting, could we, at least part of the meeting, just maybe kind of follow up on this a little bit?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any action items, but I want to look into this a little bit more, at least personally. If there are any specific action items, maybe we can go over this month, but I kind of like that idea, and I want to revisit that again.
Have you heard of GRIP, Grassroots Institute of Texas?
Which one?
GRIP, Grassroots Institute of Texas.
No, I haven't.
They're a conservative group that's trying to focus all these different groups into action in the legislature. And so they might be helpful to this
Okay. Well, send me an email with the details.
Do I have your email address anywhere? I guess.
Well, it's on the Meetup website.
Well, yeah. If nothing else, I'll do some circulating on that idea once I find the best.
Remember, you can always find me on the internet, just as long as you know my name, or Constitution Society, or Constitution.
Yeah, at least find your campaign site or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, I'm not hiding under a rock. Got my cell phone number right on the home page of the internet.
Well,
Okay. Any further questions?
Not right now.
How about you? You've been kind of quiet.
Oh, sorry. I'll come up with something in a second.
Put him on the spot.
Well, how about, can you put up any signs for me?
Yes, how many do you need to put up?
As many as you can.
Right there.
I need them put up at, preferably at intersections that where you can't help but see it,
Okay.
with more than one party's signs, so that it's kind of,
You want to take the other parties down?
no, it's so that it's obviously uncontrolled territory.
Okay.
Somebody's letting anybody put up signs there.
Yeah. I'll put them all
It probably isn't going to be a good idea to put them next to early voting sites. That's where everybody puts them, anyone can put them, but you're supposed to come back and take them down. So if you were to put them up there, you don't want to be sure to make a jot, keep notes of where you put them, and so you could go get them later.
I'll put one at my office. I'm on 281. I get lots of traffic.
Okay, that's good.
I'll put one next to my property.
I'm gonna head up too. Nice to see you
Okay,
guys.
see you later.
All right. Nice to have you.
Is the healthcare thing voluntary?
No.
Sounds like it is.
No, well, they're trying to pretend that it's voluntary by saying, oh, you can keep your existing system. But it's cleverly designed to drive the insurance companies out of the healthcare insurance business and drive employers out of the business of providing healthcare insurance for their employees. So basically, it's a clever way of herding everybody toward the single-payer system, the government system. They don't call it that. They claim that's not what they're trying to do, but the reality is that's about the only thing that can work if the statute continues to be in operation.
What? I haven't read the bill. I'm sure there's tons of penalties built in. What? My personal employer says he's probably not going to partake in this thing. He'd rather go bankrupt or quit, leave the country, whatever.
Well, of course, some of them are, there's a penalty involved. The penalty is not that much now, initially. So a lot of the employers are going to say, to heck with it, I'll just pay the penalty.
I don't think he's going to pay the penalty either, because it sounds like a non-volunteer contract.
Mm-hmm.
Indentured servitude or
Yeah.
or you're forced into a contract.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know about I've not taken many law classes. I've taken 2, but I understand forced contracts are frowned upon in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they say it's law, like what the big law is, you get to pay taxes. That's
Mhm.
voluntary.
Well, an interesting thing to compare it to is our auto liability insurance programs in the state.
Yeah.
Now, that's been challenged in court. The way that they avoid the challenge, it says, well, this is not really forcing people to buy insurance, because you always have the option of putting up a bond, or otherwise proving that you are financially able to pay to cover your liability. So it's really proof of financial capability, and you have other ways of proving it. So if Congress had done something like saying, okay, we want everyone to show proof of ability to pay your health care bills. We don't care how you do it. You can have insurance, if you have a government program, whatever you like, or you can put up a big sum of cash or buy a bond, that shows that you've got it in case the money is needed. That might survive the challenge that auto liability insurance has survived. But Congress didn't do that. They mandated insurance. So you don't have the option of proving that, hey, I'm a billionaire. If I get sick, I can pay my own bills. No, they don't allow for that. Even a billionaire has to be covered by insurance or a government program. So that's one way in which the Congress screwed up. Now, of course, there's a general problem that they're using as their authority the Commerce Clause. And in combination with the Necessary and Proper Clause. And if we really wanted to do some good, we should try to roll back on that.
Oh, big time, yeah.
Because that, especially the precedent in Wickard v. Filburn, is the basis for almost all federal criminal legislation. Gun control, drug control, all this stuff. Because it has a substantial effect on interstate commerce, they claim.
You know the year on that by chance?
1942. If you check the messages to this forum, I have a message on the subject, which takes you back to my blog, which has a bigger message on the subject.
Yeah. My 2 cents on it is, if there's an unconstitutional law, which there's a lot of them, how can they be respected? I mean, I don't think I will respect an unconstitutional law.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I'm a free citizen.
Yep.
I'm a citizen of Texas or whatever, but, that's what the law says to do, is to ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
And the unconstitutional law does not exist, never has, never will. You can write
course,
anything you want, it just does not have authority.
Yep. And that would be, what you'd be doing is engaging in civil disobedience.
Sure.
The problem is engaging in civil disobedience without being surrounded by a lot of other people engaging in the same civil disobedience on the same issue.
Well, I don't know. I think you would have a
You see, they can pick you off one at a time if you're in isolation.
Yeah.
That's why the Nullification Commission is to put the whole state on the same page of civil disobedience. So all of a sudden you're not standing alone. You've got all of your fellow Texans standing beside you. Most people are not very brave in isolation.
No, they're not.
I mean, even guys who go off to war, very few of them are able to go into battle alone in a suicide mission, unless they have seriously bonded with their teammates. And when they do that, they're doing it for their team. They're not doing it for their country or their constitution or any other abstraction. They're doing it to protect their buddies. And even if so, if their buddies didn't support what they did, with words of praise and affection and approval, they probably wouldn't do it. The guy who is prepared to stand alone against the disapproval of the world is very, very rare. I know because I've done it a lot.
That's awesome. The one thing I tell a lot of people, and everybody already knows it, is the government's bankrupt. And I think we've got that as an asset. Because eventually...
But it's a rather grim asset because it means we're all bankrupt too.
Yeah, the Federal Reserve notes that the monopoly money we use doesn't make any... It's not worth its salt. It's not worth the paper it's printed on.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's... Eventually, I'm very excited about California being bankrupt. because they're gonna be the case study for
Mhm.
what's gonna happen when one government fails, big time. Because as I understand, they have enough money through the end of the month.
Mhm.
And after that, like,
Whitman may have to be financing the state out of her own pocketbook if she wins.
yeah, I don't know how that's gonna work.
Well, right now, Jerry is leading. The voters of California continue to amaze us all by their foolishness. But if they elect Brown, I'd say let's invite Meg to come to Texas. She may need to.
Well, I mean, if the government can't fulfill its financial obligations, basic obligations, paychecks, which it looks like the federal government's gonna eventually hit that wall,
Mhm.
because it just takes one snap of the world, someone in China, someone in Hong Kong to call in their notes,
Mhm.
and that's gonna hit big problems. And I think that, it's good to watch the case study in California to predict what's gonna happen in the future. Because I don't know, when Boss and I are debating on is there gonna be social anarchy, which that's what he's suspecting.
Mhm.
I'm not quite sure, because it's hard to cash an IOU to pay your rent, to buy groceries.
Mhm.
And
But of course, if everybody's in the same boat, then you can say, okay, my paycheck bounced, I don't have the rent, what are you going to do? Evict me? I mean, the constables quit too, because he hasn't been paid.
Yeah. Well, eventually, if that happens here, if the IRS collectors, with the jailers, with the peace officers, eventually won't get paid. Now, granted, Texas has got its own balanced budget,
Mm-hmm.
but some of the other states in the union don't.
No, well, Texas is about the only part of the world of its size that's self-supporting in resources.
Yes.
If push comes to shove, we can shove the rest of the world into the ocean and still survive.
What are the steps it takes to do that? Because most law professors I've spoken to don't want to get into details on it, because I think they're uneducated on the topic. And-
Well, it was just not since the Civil War has the subject come up.
Well, I think it's going to eventually rise. I
Yeah.
hope so. I mean, but
Well, what is likely to happen is with the collapse of the banks, and the first big problem is going to be food. Getting food from the farm or ranch to the people who need to eat it. So we're going to be having to set up some sort of barter system. Now, some of us are already working on an alternative to Federal Reserve notes. The technique is called LOOM, L-O-O-M. And basically what it involves is creating digital certificates for something. It could be gold, silver, bushels of wheat, hours of labor, whatever you want. So if you've got it, you can create a digital certificate for it. And let's say, for example, that it's an ingot of copper. So you have got an ingot of copper. You issue the digital certificate to somebody for that ingot of copper. You still keep the ingot, because you're now serving as a kind of a repository for it. But somebody else can get your digital certificate and exchange it for somebody else's ingot, if that's what he wants, or trade it for a digital certificate backed by something else. But each certificate is backed by something. You can't duplicate it. It's peer-to-peer. It's totally secure. And it's basically the idea is that we create digital certificates for all everything of value that we can, and then start trading them. And that could serve as the currency for a new economy. And of course, people would have to have computers and the internet to make use of this. But as long as we've got that, we should be able to sustain an economy of commodities and services.
Yeah, I'm not.
But of course,
sure.
only a few people are aware of it now. So if we suddenly found ourselves having to, switch to it, most people wouldn't know how to do it.
I personally am not concerned about bartering. I've done it a lot, still do it today.
Mhm.
I think that's a viable option. My big concern would be, I don't know, amongst other things, like FEMA, I think would be a big concern. And
Well, of course, they might not be being paid either.
yeah, that's what I'm hoping. That's what I think.
Although the problem is the guys with the guns are probably going to get fed. But of course, we have guns too.
Exactly.
And that's maybe what it comes down to.
Could it feasibly happen to get the state removed from the union?
Well, I don't think it's worthwhile to just say we secede.
Why is that?
I think it's more a matter of pulling in the ways in which we are dependent on the central government or even on other states, sort of withdrawing into ourselves, taking care of our own. And then if others want to join us in doing that, we can cooperate on a case-by-case basis. But in effect, it would be localizing the functions of government and the economy.
Well, that's what the Constitution says.
Well, and it would be what we would have to do in practice.
Yeah.
So eventually, there wouldn't be formal secession. There would just be a central government left there, writing checks to each other that nobody could cash, while the rest of us would be leading our lives.
Would a resolution?
And maybe we could organize tours to go back to Washington, D.C. and say, gee, this used to be the seat of government of the United States. Of course, they don't have nobody pays any attention to them anymore, but here they are, walking around the former national capital, because of course they can't get gas or haven't operate any vehicles, but here they are walking.
Yeah, scary. My senator representative that covers me is sent me a letter saying that he wants to get in compliance with the federal government. And that scared the hell out of me.
Mhm.
Because when, as a Texan, said I want to do this to give a thumbs up to DC, I've never met one.
Mhm.
I mean, maybe there's a liberal in Austin that I've not met yet, but I was trying to think why he would want to get in compliance with the federal law and what the reason. I guess there's a barter exchange of money or something that the Commerce Clause probably provides. I guess transportation dollars or something. Was it possible to get, would it be feasible to create, instead of employers withholding tax money and sending it directly to the IRS, to send it to the state of Texas?
No,
Not at all?
no, they're set up to collect it directly.
Yeah, but couldn't you set up an operation to send it to the states themselves and then send it to the IRS?
Well, if you send it to the state wouldn't know what to do with it.
Well, if you
And secondly, the feds would just say, you haven't paid us. We don't care if you send your money to the state of Texas. That's your money. You can do it. If you want to do that, you can, but you still owe us. That doesn't help you one bit.
to be used as bargaining power
No,
for the individual states.
no. The state can't make you pay them instead of the feds. Yeah, there are a lot of people come up with a lot of ideas that, because they don't really understand how the system works. And they can waste an awful lot of time, you know, being excited about, let's face it, bad ideas. You really have to know what you're doing. That's why ultimately it comes down to, you know, if you're not prepared to do all the work of understanding these systems yourself, that you've got to identify someone who does and get behind him. And in all immodesty, I don't know of anyone else who understands these things as well as I do. Even a lot of my fellow reformers, lawyers and scholars and, you know, the best and brightest in this country, most of them are weak on the details.
Yeah.
They have not really thought it through.
But you didn't go to law school, did you?
No.
How the hell did you learn all this?
Taught myself. My formal training is in math, physics, and computer science. And I find, interestingly enough, that it is people with my academic background who usually get it first. It's not the ones who went to law school. There's no really good substitute for the kind of skills one acquires as a scientist, especially in the hard sciences, mathematics, engineering, computer science, where you're having to think every day in very rigorous ways. Most people do not think very rigorously. Their thinking is very fuzzy. And you can't solve these problems with fuzzy thinking.
I'm really curious though, like, I know that our state is superior to the rest because we've got an okay economy and we've got a balanced budget, but I'm really wondering if a few other states have to get bailed out and what would happen if the federal even has the power to do that. I don't think they do.
Now, eventually they run out of money.
Because that would be private sector.
They can only print so much money.
Yeah,
Right now they're into an orgy of printing money.
yeah, and then the quantitative easing.
It's not truly printing, it's creating.
It's created digitally, yeah.
Yeah, digitally, yeah.
But it's still, I don't understand, like, at what point will the central banking system fail? Because it looks to me like it's already failed. But then again, I see things differently.
It's running essentially on psychology.
So the uneducated masses.
In other words, the emperor has no clothes, but people are still telling the emperor he's got clothes.
Yeah.
There are a few people who are telling the emperor he doesn't have any clothes, but at this point he's saying, well, maybe I don't, but I don't want to admit it to anybody. So all you people just keep telling me I've got clothes, and I'll keep telling you that I've got clothes, and don't listen to that fellow over there.
During the upcoming legislative session, I don't know much about Texas politics besides what I studied in college. Because there's what, 90 days that they're actually...
140.
Okay, 140 days that they're playing government.
Mm-hmm.
How feasible is it to get a law passed? Like, how much effort does it take? Like, if I wanted to get a law proposed and get it to go through the House?
Well,
and
the answer is that if it's just a small thing, like one clause, and there's no opposition, and you get the support of a key committee member, that may be all it takes. On the other hand, if those conditions are not met, especially if you get down to the end of the session And remember, this is a redistricting year.
Yeah, so there it is.
It's going to be very hard for them to get around to your thing. It may slip in, or you may have to go through several sessions. Could take a decade or more. So it can be done, but if you either have a huge amount of support or the support of just a key member and no opposition. The trick is having influence with that one key member.
How do you get that? Is it by influence, or do you just have to rub elbows appropriately?
A variety of ways. I mean, the main guy I was going to use is a high school classmate. And he married a high school classmate of mine. So it's an old crony.
Yeah.
I actually know a lot of people in state government. I've just been around for so long. And that's part of what works. It's just knowing them. See them again and again and again and again, chatting with them and knowing their families and their, going to church with them and going golfing with them, and, just it's personal relationships. They feel confident with you, they're more likely to do something for you. Of course, if you raise enough money to get them elected, they are even more comfortable with you.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to leave here pretty soon.
Of course.
They want us out by 8:45, so
The
if you could push that red button there.
Right here in the back?
Yeah.